Somebody told me I made the best jelly roll in town.
So, have you ever read a passage from, well, let me just say it like this. I don't know if you have, but I have. So, today I was rereading a James Baldwin book, and I was looking at it because I was talking to my mother yesterday, and my mother says this all the time. She says that I used to have flow, like James Baldwin, and that's when she was convinced that I would be a writer. And I've always considered James Baldwin's stuff a little very powerful, and so it's not. I've never been like consumed like with James Baldwin's writing. Like I have to read like all this stuff. Like um, I'd heard about Alice Walker's stuff, for example, all my life because my mother's a big fan of her, and her friends they always talk about her books. And but for me, I never read any of her books until I got to a point where like I just picked up one. I was like, oh, let me look at this. I think it was the Temple. No, it wasn't Temple of My Familiar. It was Possessing the Secret of Joy. And once I read that, I could not stop reading Alice Walker. I like inhaled Alice Walker. For me, James Baldwin has never been like that. And I've always known that people like Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, I know that they read James Walker Baldwin and they reflect upon him in their work. And so for me, his stuff is just like, it's so large. And it's like, I almost feel like I'm going to live that life too. Like, I remember when I read Giovanni's Room, and I knew that I would live in Europe someday. I had a Europe, probably had a European, was that? Yeah, I was dating a Spanish man at the time. And, and you're reading these things, and it's like, especially as a black person going to Europe, I mean, we have such a cultural influence just from that experience being black in Europe that has impacted, I would say, black culture over and over and over. So James Baldwin again is one of those people. Um, and what's interesting is that, and what's also been very painful, growing up in America in a time when people didn't talk about race openly, is that alongside that, there were people like James Baldwin who actually did talk about race. Do you know what I mean? There are people like James Baldwin who talked about race in context. And without further ado, let me just tell you what he means. Well, what I understood that to mean. Because I'm so tired of people, pointing out racist when you want to talk about race. Racist and race are different. Or I'm not a racist, and I've come to understand that being a racist is probably one of the biggest insults for white people. I didn't understand that until like recently, because it's all just a part of the larger conversation of race, um, and this is why. So, in Nobody Knows My Name, um, James Baldwin is writing. He's strongest in his essayist, as people say. He's strongest in his essay form, and so this is a collection of essays. In a sense, it's an anthology that he has collected, that he's edited of his own stuff. I like James Baldwin a lot. So these essays are a very small part of a private logbook. The question of color takes up much space in these pages, but the question of color, especially in this country, operates to hide the graver questions of the self. When I read this, I was like, I had to stop and look at the cover again. I started looking, I was looking at him, I was like, what about, like, who is this person? Like, what about his life marks him? Because he's just dented me. When I read that passage, I was like, I'm transformed. I'm a different person. I've seen that this is it. That's like a clear articulation of what it is that bugs me about how race is discussed in popular culture in America. And I think Fox is only an extreme, a modern extreme, but it's always been there. I mean, look at Ronald Reagan. But this idea of that race impacts our lives, and that unless we can unpack that impact, unless we can talk about race in the sense of the much space that race takes up in these pages. But it's not about pointing, I mean, it's not centering that I would say fearful white ego that you're going to be called a racist. It's not that. Race is much more complex than that. It is for James Baldwin, and my suspicion is that it is for white people as well. But what's interesting is that you don't have white writers, especially writing about the experience and being conscious of the fact that they are white. You only have this in travel writing. So you look at someone like J.R. Ackerley, a European who also went east, as James Baldwin did, but instead of crossing the Atlantic, he went from the UK and crossed Eurasia and ended up here in India. And he saw how his race was a privilege. Um, and now, 80 years later, as cultural anthropologists, we're critiquing that work. But for me, James Baldwin's work has always been that roadmap of a vision of the world and how to really place oneself within that vision and how to, place all of oneself, including one's own experience. And this is where a lot of academic work that becomes apolitical, they're really just concealing race or class or caste, as it is here in India, or gender. Think about, some of the greatest strides that feminist work has made is in just saying that there are women who have voices. They came from under the purdah. They came from under the chador. But the reality is women are still not equal in societal influence openly, I would say, and visibly as men in any society. That's a curious question that I have. And it's one of those kinds of curious questions that someone like James Baldwin, who crosses class lines in his life, crosses racial lines in his life, crosses national lines in his life, physically crossing all these social lines. And he just not just reflects on it, but engages the world around it. And that's what, makes us makes cultural anthropology in a sense. And so I think that I see him as a founder. He's a founding anthropologist. And you just even look at his writing style. So I'm trying to get my flow back. So I started reading him, and I'm just like, and I stopped after reading that. I read a page and a half, and I just had to look at his picture, and I'm like, damn. Who is he to be so all that? He is all that. If I could be half the man that this man is. And what's funny about it, and listen up, black people, this is where it's at. He says how he did it. In America, the color of my skin had stood between myself and me. In Europe, that barrier was down. This is the first page. This is just the introduction. He continues, nothing is more desirable than to be released from an affliction, but nothing is more frightening than to be divested of a crutch. So he's talking about when he figured out that he was ready to move somewhere from Europe, and he, I assume, saw it as a crutch. And he decided that he could go anywhere, but he wanted to go back to America. And funny enough, I'm finishing hopefully my degree soon, and I'm thinking about where I would go. And I've been thinking about going to America a lot. But the idea of just, this race question and going to live race, just having to do race all over again, it's everywhere. Certainly, all of my videos show how much it is here in India. And also in Europe, where you have a lot of people like James Baldwin writing about it. But in America, the public conversation, the national conversation is so base that I find it very frustrating. I find a great deal of solace in people like James Baldwin, but also just people in my immediate environment who are sympathetic to the full experience of living in America and not just cutting ourselves off to the myth. So reading has always done that for me. Reading can take you anywhere. You don't even have to get out of your seat. Read! Oh, and get on the floor and dance with me. Get your back up off the wall.